I was kind of disappointed by the way that the political right responded to the UK-India trade deal. We're getting rid of 99% of tariffs. I think I read India is getting rid of 90% of tariffs and cutting the tariffs that remain quite significantly. We should just get rid of national insurance ultimately. New Zealand did it, having inherited a very similar system to our own. I'm not sure that it puts us in a better position than we were before Trump became president.
No.
I mean, we're still worse off.
You can tell that it isn't a proper trade deal just from the fact that there hasn't been a wave of moral panic about how this is going to lead to the privatization of the NHS.
Hello and welcome to the IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Clougherty, the IEA's Executive Director, and Kristian Niemietz, the IEA's Editorial Director. Today we're going to be discussing the two new trade agreements that were announced this week, the right's reaction, plus Northern Ireland's new approach to the National Health Service. So we've had two trade deals announced this week. Tom, would you like to kick us off by discussing the UK and India's trade deal?
Yeah, well, I think it's a wholly good thing. I mean, it's been years in the works. It's one of those things that people can point to if they're so inclined as a benefit of Brexit. As I understand it, this is a more significant trade agreement than India has signed with any other country. And of course, India is a massive country, a growing economy. And, you know, we're seeing a kind of eastern shift in economic activity in the locus of power. So these are all good things. Actually, I mean, my big takeaway from the trade deal, well, let's say there are two. There are two big takeaways. The first one is we call it a free trade agreement. It doesn't necessarily give you free trade as classical liberals and free marketeers would often talk about it. You know, yes, we're getting rid of 99% of tariffs. I think I read India is getting rid of 90% of tariffs and cutting the tariffs that remain quite significantly. They're still going to have a 75% tariff. That's half what it was, but it's still pretty high on gin and whiskey. Nonetheless, the booze industry is cock-a-hoop at better access to Indian markets. And so on. I mean, I point to this to say that there is a difference between the kind of pure free trade idea of Smith and Ricardo and everyone else and what you actually get through modern trade deals. And I know that's sometimes something that libertarians get upset about, but I think it's letting the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we should take these wins when we get them. I mean, I do think that there is something also to be said here about the way that we're in a world now where trade liberalisation is all about fairly complicated bilateral deals with a lot of horse trading involved. Again, this is better than nothing, and it will lead to rising prosperity and so on in a limited way. It's not as good or as desirable, I think, as the much broader-based multilateral liberalisation that we had many rounds of, sort of from the Second World War until the early 2000s. Equally, and we always have to bang this drum, it isn't as good as simply saying we will trade freely. No tariffs, no non-tariff barriers, no restraints on competition. Let's just go for it. All of that aside, though, I think this is something that, you know, the government deserves some praise for and their predecessors deserve some praise for. It's a win. The other point that I want to make here, actually, though, is that I was kind of disappointed by the way that the political right, whether it's the Conservatives, whether it's Reform, responded to the UK-India trade deal, because this is something that they will have talked up in years gone by. This is something that they would have thought very specifically of as a benefit of Brexit. When it actually happens, obviously the problem is it was delivered by the other side, and politics being what it is, a very grubby business, oppositions oppose, blah, 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 fine. But I think the way that they picked up on this issue of national insurance exemptions for 3 years for Indian secondees. So basically, if you're in India, you're working for an Indian company and your business sends you to the UK to work in the branch here, you will be exempt from paying national insurance for 3 years, so long as you are paying the Indian equivalent social security taxes. This seems to me to be a perfectly sensible and fair thing, because after all, if you're only here for 3 years, you are not going to build up. First of all, you're not going to be entitled to working age benefits. Secondly, you're not going to retire here, so there's no point building up an entitlement to the state pension. More to the point, and also, by the way, you avoid double taxation, which can happen with the timing of these things, where you end up paying social security taxes in both countries for at least part of the time, and that is a massive disincentive to movement, and it inhibits cross-border business and everything else. Crucially, this is a very normal thing in international taxation, tax treaties, social security, totalization agreements, I think they call them. And yet, the political right, who should know better, reacted as though this was some kind of bizarre subsidy to Indian immigrants. And isn't that terrible? Isn't this the government selling out the British worker again? Maybe some of them believe it. I doubt it. I think it's cynicism. But what I really worry about is that it suggests something that, has been a concern for some time, that the political right will increasingly abandon free market economics, will focus more and more, even when they know better, on cultural issues, issues of national identity and everything else. And this perhaps paints an unhappy picture of the future of the political landscape in the UK, because I don't think we can rely on the left to become cosmopolitan libertarians who embrace free markets. Equally, if the political right is going to abandon those things as well, we may not end up in a very pretty place.
I think you're absolutely right, specifically to call the UK-India trade deal as a huge Brexit win. Of course, it wouldn't be possible if we were members of the European Union. But it's also really interesting, I think, even just moving the national insurance issue aside, a lot of the benefits of free trade weren't necessarily being discussed when it came to this deal. I mean, the idea that specifically on things like manufactured goods, on things like clothes and shoes and even whiskey from the UK, these are really, really big wins. And actually, fundamentally, no individual can create everything they consume. No family or household can create everything they consume. And so no country should seek to create everything that they consume. And it's those fundamental concepts that actually in some other countries where labour costs may be low or for whatever reason, things that are produced more cheaply being imported is a good thing. And I think one of the largest misconceptions on free trade specifically is that it's only a win when you're exporting stuff. But actually that's entirely untrue, and that one of the largest benefits of free trade is the importation of goods that are made by foreigners, that are made more cheaply and more efficiently. And so I think that argument wasn't necessarily being made. And I share your disappointment, Tom, that actually the fact that a lot of the right were so quick to jump on the national insurance issue and not, first of all, focus on the huge wins that we actually saw, I think are right. I had a bit of a disagreement with you, actually, on the national insurance issue. I do think that what it does do is it reveals the complete sham that is national insurance and social security. I mean, I think that national insurance is effectively just another income tax. And so it is wrong to effectively argue that that particular money is being siphoned off, and that you pay into that every single year, and that then just stays in a little pot in the treasury. And then when you turn a certain age and you're able to get out of it, or indeed if you fall on hard times, you're able to get out of it, or indeed that it pays for the NHS. So all of these arguments, I think, are completely fine in the law, but actually in practice, we know that a lot of these benefits are being paid for through general taxation. The problem is, of course, this isn't new, right? We've got this reciprocal arrangement with at least 17 other countries, including the entirety of the European Union. Yeah. So it doesn't make sense to be upset about it purely as a result of this trade deal. And again, the wins are huge.
We should just get rid of national insurance, ultimately. Yes. New Zealand did it, having inherited a very similar system to our own. And it is, when you compare different tax systems around the world, the odd status of national insurance in this country is one of the things that makes cross-border comparisons a little bit difficult, because other countries operate sort of what you would think of as proper contributory social insurance systems through their equivalents of national insurance. We really don't, although I think it is also wrong to say that it is purely the same thing as income tax. The base is different. The period of calculation is different. Obviously the rates are different. It built into it is eligibility for various benefits, even though it's not actually tied to how much you pay in, as long as you pay in a certain fairly de minimis amount. So it occupies this weird hybrid position in the tax system at the moment.
That's true. That's very true.
Well, yeah, the presentation, of course, could have been improved. The way I would have done it is simply to say, if you work here, you pay the same tax rates, national insurance, whatever, as everyone else. But if you move back to your country of origin within a certain time frame, then the UK government is going to transfer that money to the Social Security Agency of that country. And that would have had the same net outcome as the arrangement that we're now apparently going to get, but it would have looked very different on the presentation side. Nonetheless, it is, I share the disappointment that that accounted for 90% of the coverage, and particularly from the political right, who for years, one of the arguments was that, outside of the EU, we could, UKIP, the predecessor of the Reform Party, even had this cringeworthy song about 12 years ago, where the UKIP Calypso song, where I'm not going to sing any passages now, but where they say we can trade with the world again when Nigel is at number 10. And, well, okay, Nigel isn't literally at number 10, but he has had a certain influence. And Brexit is among other people's, he was one of the co-creators, one of the people who kept Euroscepticism going when it was a very unfashionable cause. And yes, I think if you are a Eurosceptic, that is the main point that you should make. You should say this is one of the Brexit wins. This is something that we've been talking about for a long time, and now it is finally happening. And okay, even if you don't agree with the specifics of a double taxation treaty, or you could even argue, okay, 3 years. Well, if you live somewhere for 3 years, you are a resident of that country, even if you have the intention of moving back at some point. But nonetheless, these are relatively minor things. If that's what it takes to get a deal like this over the line, then I'd say even if I wouldn't have done it in exactly that way, well, let's just take the win.
Yeah, this is not a very serious point, but I think we should start doing like post-credit scenes, like superhero movies for the podcast. And this week's one will be Kristian singing UKIP Calypso. It's going to do massive numbers. I just one more point on this, actually, because it's something I thought about this week. We had David Friedman here at the IEA, son of Milton Friedman, author of The Machinery of Freedom and many other things subsequent to that. And that will be available on the IEA YouTube channel in due course. But he was talking about free trade. And he was, in fact, the title of his talk was Ptolemaic Tariffs, because he was effectively trying to argue, I think with some success, that the anti-trade attitude, sort of the mercantilist attitude, is so outdated. It was thoroughly refuted, 200 plus years ago, and yet people still cling to it for some reason. And there are public choice reasons for that, concentrated benefits of protectionism, dispersed benefits of free trade. And I guess there are just sort of instinctive reasons that we just tend to prioritize people like us, our fellow countrymen, and think of foreigners in a different category and everything. But I think it's important always to bear this in mind, that it's easy to talk about free trade and think, well, this is an international economics thing. It's important, but it's a bit niche. It's a separate area, and trade policy is quite complicated. So I see why people think that. But ultimately, we have to bear in mind that I think probably the fundamental point of free market economics is that free exchange is mutually beneficial. It wouldn't happen otherwise. And it is the multiplication of those mutually beneficial exchanges that creates wealth and drives progress and everything else. And it doesn't matter if you're engaging in mutually beneficial free exchange with someone from India or someone from the United States or from wherever. The same logic applies. And so this actually is completely central to everything that we stand for. And again, I'll just say, if the political right is so quick to criticize, and in some cases to engage in a kind of demagoguery and try and whip up kind of anti-foreigner sentiment on the basis of a trade deal, I just kind of think that's appalling.
Yeah, it's absolutely appalling. I think definitely the reaction in comparison to the US-India trade on the UK-India trade on the US-UK trade, I think is really interesting, especially the way that the comms sort of worked. It's also interesting in the way that both countries, when it came to the UK and India, the way in which the comms actually worked. I mean, Narendra Modi actually broke the embargo on the press release himself by just posting on his Twitter account saying how amazing it was. So the comms, I think, were a little bit less aligned, whereas obviously with the UK and the US, they had that quite bizarre press conference.
I'm not sure the comms were aligned. I mean, I don't think we should dwell on the comms too much, but I mean, Trump just posted it in block capitals that there was going to be a big, beautiful deal announced this afternoon at the White House.
Well, I think the language worked a bit better, especially kind of looking at a lot of the concerns that I think the UK were going to have. And I think he was giving Sir Keir Starmer a few favours with that. So let's talk about the US-UK trade deal. What was interesting to me is that there are always two areas that a lot of people thought, had to happen if a trade deal was to ever be negotiated between the UK and the US. And that was on the digital services tax and also on chicken. I mean, it seemed as though those two areas were sort of done deal. They have to be negotiated. But of course, they weren't seen in this deal at all. I think some of the bigger wins, which is quite interesting, on steel and aluminium, 25% tariffs completely axed, which is quite positive. On agriculture, it seems as though beef is going to be one of the key areas where we're going to see tariff-free trade, with 13,000 metric tons of meat being in that quota, tariff-free quota as well. And Trump, interestingly, talking about the cons of it, kind of played down one of the questions of food safety in agriculture and sort of said, well, the UK can take what they want. And I think that's really interesting because I think it was a clear move away from the protectionist perspective that he was definitely sort of dominating his language, whereas in the press conference he was talking about the benefits of choice, the benefits of abundance, and I think that that's a clear shift as well. Also, the fact that the key advisor, that the sort of architect of Liberation Day, using quote marks, he wasn't there in the Oval Office during the conference announcement. So I do think that is interesting, just from their own shift away from it.
I think it would be very welcome if it did signal a shift to a more open trading kind of attitude from the Trump administration. And if it was the herald of that kind of thing coming, I could see why he would start with the UK. The UK in many cases, should just be the easiest one to do. Now, on the other hand, I got to say, I'm a little bit of a cynic about this trade deal. Now, there were some nice numbers in what you just said there. But for me, this is a deal and it's about trade, but it's not really what we would normally think of as a trade deal. It's certainly not what we were talking about during Trump's first term or the whole kind of post-Brexit era. This is not a fully fledged free trade agreement by any stretch of the imagination. It's a lot better than nothing, but I'm not sure that it puts us in a better position than we were before Trump became president.
No.
We're still worse off.
And we still have,
and so are the Americans, by the way.
We still have the blanket 10% tariff.
Yeah.
That's really the key there. And it does, I think, suggest that the argument isn't necessarily about free trade as a concept, but the language is definitely being shifted. I think you're absolutely right. This isn't a fully comprehensive free trade agreement, but what it is good in specific industries and specific circumstances. I think steel and aluminium is one example of that. Cars, I think, are interesting. They've slashed from 27.5% to 10%, but it's a quota of 100,000. Last year, we only exported 92,000 cars.
Bluntly, yes. We're not sending a lot of cars to the US. We're not exporting a lot of steel and aluminium.
And also in practice with cars, it's almost a bit of a cap, right? The fact that the tariff change is only applicable to 100,000 cars, which is almost already what we're exporting to the US. So I think you're absolutely right there. It's interesting. It's obviously not fully comprehensive, but it definitely does signal, I think, a move towards an openness from the United States at the very least, and especially on language.
Well, yes, there were passages, there were parts of that press conference where I thought, wait, this almost sounds like trade is good. He's close to getting it. Now, hold that thought and just go a little bit further here. But no, I think this is as good as it was ever going to get. Obviously, Donald Trump was not suddenly going to have a conversion and become a believer in free trade. So anyone who expected more from this was probably deluding themselves, was never going to be any better than this. You can tell that it isn't a proper trade deal just from the fact that there hasn't been a wave of moral panic about how this is going to lead to the privatization of the NHS. If it were a proper trade deal, that would be a massive thing. You would have several large campaign groups going on about that, because that was a thing during the TTIP negotiations when we were still in the EU, which would have been an EU-US trade deal, and then the post-Brexit deal with Boris Johnson and Trump. So that was a big thing then. Nothing of that kind now. That shows, well, this isn't a trade deal in the conventional sense. What it does is really, it gets rid of some of the sector by sector specific tariffs, which is a step in the right direction because it leads to a less distortionary form of protectionism. I think I said just before on the podcast that if you must have tariffs, obviously, ideally, you shouldn't. Ideally, the optimal tariff rate is 0. But if you must have tariffs, at least make sure that it is a standard tariff rate that you apply to everything, and no special carve-outs for this sector or that sector. And that's what we had before the announcement what we still have right now, that there are lots of special tariffs for particular products and industries. And if some of that is being reined back and we're moving towards something closer to a flat 10%, and that's largely it, then that is a step in the right direction. But of course, we're still worse off than before the so-called Liberation Day. So if we could just go back to the status quo and to the Biden arrangement, then we'd be better off for that.
It does also signal potentially the kind of argument that all of these tariffs were being implemented so that Trump could then start negotiating all of these trade agreements. And I do think that there might be some validity in that argument, that actually this was all a large political ploy from Trump. I mean, whether or not any of the countries that are able to negotiate a trade agreement are able to get one that is better than the deal or arrangement that they had before Trump came into power, I think is a separate question.
I mean, I admire your optimism, Reem. Yes, I mean, look, it would be great if this was just the start. And I mean, there were genuine rumblings during the first Trump term that he and others in the administration were very open to a proper free trade agreement with the UK. And I was part of a project that Daniel Hannan led. And it involved people from US think tanks like Cato and people from the IEA and from the Centre for Policy Studies, where I was working at the time, basically to come up with a draft free trade agreement between the US and the UK. I mean, I don't want to claim any real credit for myself, because the main people who wrote that were Shankar Singham, formerly of this parish, and Barney Reynolds, who's a lawyer who particularly works on like financial services regulation and international trade and stuff. So the point of that, though, and I'd encourage people to go and take a look at it. I think Dan Hannan's Institute for Free Trade will probably be the best place to find it. But look, the point was that was a model trade deal for a new kind of services-based economy. Now, you get rid of all the tariffs, obviously, but you're also working to remove the non-tariff barriers in the big areas that we have comparative advantages in, both in the US and in the UK. And that's the kind of stuff that we should be talking about when it comes to free trade with America. It shouldn't be like aluminum tariffs. Look, I said it the American way. You can tell I lived there for 6 years. But we will have to grapple with this ludicrous chlorinated chicken, privatize the NHS, all of these issues in a proper free trade agreement. We will have to come up with them. Now, of course, as free marketeers, as libertarians, we're in a strange situation here, because all of the things, the horrible demands that the American trade negotiators will make of Britain are all things that we support anyway, right? There is nothing wrong with chicken being chlorine washed. If you don't want to buy chicken that's been chlorine washed, don't. But how many Brits go to America and eat their Kentucky Fried Chicken or their Chick-fil-A? That's my favorite.
No problem at all.
With no problem whatsoever. So many of the, and look at the digital services tax. It's a terrible tax. It's a tax on turnover. It doesn't make any sense. Online safety bill, which many Americans on the right rightly say is a massive imposition on free speech. Of course it is, and a lot of this stuff is targeted at American industries, big tech. Those are things that we're going to have to work on. And I think from our side, the things that we really want in negotiations with America would be kind of on investment, on financial and professional services, and breaking down some of those regulatory barriers that also act as inhibitors to trade.
That's absolutely true. A lot of that also does have to happen domestically. I think that there has to be that political appetite for it as well. Interestingly, Oxford Economics did some quick fire analysis after the trade agreement was announced and made no update to their growth targets or indeed their projection on inflation or growth. So I think it's interesting from that perspective. Clearly, even just in the short term, it looks as though there won't be much of an impact on the UK economy as a whole. However, I'm going to instill some optimism. It did sound as though, at least from the press conference, that Trump used the words room to grow. There's room to grow. There are still things that can be negotiated. And perhaps, Tom, some of those asks will be included. We must remain optimistic. Let's move on.
But it is a trade deal which he is signing. So he can't now say all trade is bad. He has to sound a bit more as if he gets it. It doesn't mean that he actually gets it. But the thing is that it comes to Trump will not be president forever. And once an arrangement is there, a future administration can build on it.
And that's from our in-house expert on optimism.
It's a step in the right direction, but we can definitely do more. Kristian, you'd like to talk a little bit about what's happening in Northern Ireland with the NHS?
Yes, so they're coming up with an arrangement, the Northern Irish NHS, where if you are on a waiting list for some conditions and it is clear that you're not going to get treated anytime soon, you will be able to get to seek treatment abroad. And initially, abroad just means the Republic of Ireland, but there are plans to extend that to elsewhere in the EU. And you can then claim the money back, the cost of that treatment, up to what it would have cost if you had been treated on the Northern Irish NHS. Clearly a sensible arrangement. It expands patient choice, and if it's cost neutral, why not? It just makes you wonder, why haven't they always done it this way? Surely this is the sort of thing where ideally if you must have an organization like the NHS, that's what it should be like. It should just be like a big national health insurer that says, okay, you are entitled to this treatment. It costs whatever, £5,000. We don't insist on providing it ourselves. You can go wherever you want and get it. We give you, so to speak, a voucher or a quasi voucher, and what you want to do with it is then up to you. Of course, it is a voucher is tied to a specific type of product. You can't then say, no, I just want to go on a foreign holiday instead. It has to be medical treatment of a particular kind. But where you get that, that should be up to you. It should always have been operated in that way. And there are examples, some of the systems that I bang on about. They've been doing it that way for a while already. So some Dutch health insurers came up with this years ago already, didn't require any political decisions, where they just said, okay, we have a lack of specialties in this area, or somebody on the other side of the border is better equipped to do that. You can get treatment on the Belgian side or on the German side of the border. We will still reimburse you, and why not? Why wouldn't they, as a medium-sized country? And there, it wasn't a health minister or prime minister or government that came up with the idea. It was just the health insurers had the option to do that themselves, and solutions like that just come up from within the system. It doesn't need to be imposed, and you don't need a political discussion. It's not about, oh, do people actually want to do this, and is this actually the right way of doing it? No, you could just, some insurers offer it, and if that's what you want, you can do it. If not, then you don't. Yeah, no political discussion.
It's excellent because it, of course, does expand that patient choice in such a minuscule way, but it obviously does do that. I'm assuming it also then relieves some pressure from the Northern Irish NHS, the fact that they aren't then required to actually provide those services. Is it comprehensive for every treatment, or is it just specific?
No, that's the problem. It's a specific list of treatments, and only when the expected waiting time is above a certain limit. So in practice, it will be quite limited, but there just aren't many good ideas around. And the idea itself is good, but as always, when politicians come up with something sensible, they then come up with lots of limitations to it. Yeah. But for once,
and it's not altogether new, right? I mean, things like this have happened before. I mean, I think Tony Blair, to try and get waiting lists down when he pumped a lot of money into the NHS, expanded the ability of private providers to participate in the NHS system on that kind of tariff basis. Different kind of tariff we're talking about there. But also, I mean, I'm raiding the memory banks a bit here, but I'm pretty sure that this was the Conservative Party's policy at the 2005 general election when Michael Howard was the leader of the opposition, and it was called the patient passport. And the idea was that you could, precisely as you suggest, if the NHS couldn't treat you within a specified time frame, you could go to the private sector. I don't know if they had the option then to go abroad, but if they had done, that would make perfect sense as well. Just get the treatment that you need. Don't sit on the waiting list getting worse for, a long period of time. Perfectly logical, perfectly sensible. But the reason that this sticks in my mind, and people will forgive me if they were around at the time and they remember the details of the actual policy better than I do. The reason it stuck in my mind is because I can recall going to one of those party leadership debates in 2005 or 2006, whenever it was, and it was David Cameron against David Davis. And one of the big arguments that David Cameron was making was how terrible the patient passport was and how he would scrap it as an item of Conservative Party policy. What was really kind of took my breath away a little bit, it shows how naive I was, is that this idea got a massive round of applause from the assembled Conservative Party members, who apparently also thought that any kind of incremental pathway into the NHS for the private sector was a terrible thing, whether for political reasons or whether for practical reasons, I don't really know. Obviously, I was there for kind of with different purposes in mind. But anyway, this is not a new idea. It's knocked around for a while. It's a good idea. It's nice that Northern Ireland is now doing it in a limited way. But we've got massive waiting lists across the UK, throughout the NHS. And I know it's been talked about, maybe Wes Streeting will, edge in this direction as well. Let's just get on with it.
It does show how much the Overton window really truly has shifted on the NHS. I mean, I've not seen any real backlash from the Northern Irish government. I mean, have there been much backlash?
Well, I was on BBC Radio Northern Ireland Unders, and I wouldn't say backlash, but some of the other interview guests that they had did say they weren't saying we're against it and scrap it, but they did say, well, but this is going to be unequal, because if you go abroad, you have to first of all pay for that treatment out of pocket and then claim it back. Now that means that you have to have some money in the bank, or at least the ability to raise.
What an interesting perception. And if you have less money, you are not able to.
Yeah. But that would have been the David Cameron position as well into the I'm guessing. It's usually this egalitarian objection. That's always been the case with choice-based reforms in healthcare, even when there's no monetary payment involved. But that was one of the objections against the Blair era reforms as well at the time, that better educated, more knowledgeable people are more likely to make use of it. And therefore it's going to be somewhat unequal in its outcomes. And maybe it does. I think that wasn't the case with the Blair era reforms, but it is, yes, a possibility. But just this idea that, just because not everybody's going to use these extra opportunities, nobody should have it. It's just a bizarre idea. But when it comes to the NHS, and that is baked into the NHS cult, that is very much this aggressive leveling down egalitarianism. Is absolutely.
So, I mean, first of all, maybe voucherization deals with that problem of people having to pay out of pocket. To the extent that you think people paying out of pocket is a problem, actually, I think some degree of out of pocket payment works quite well, actually, in a healthcare system as a whole. Exactly that. But then you could deal with that by saying you effectively take the cash is portable from the NHS, that then you can go and spend it somewhere else. You don't necessarily need people to pay wholly out of pocket and then reclaim back. But the second point, this idea that, well, this just lets the sharp-elbowed richer people get ahead. This is one of the pathologies of nationalised healthcare systems as well. I think, is it Julian Legrand? He was a health economist at the LSE. This is one of his arguments, actually, that the way the NHS and most public services work is not really in an egalitarian way, because they're bureaucratic and they're often hard to navigate. It is precisely the more educated, middle class, richer, pushier people who expect more, who end up getting more. So this idea that a nationalised system is wholly egalitarian simply because that's its sort of foundational ethos and because it's funded out of taxation actually turns out not to be true in a great many cases. And that was always the case as well with schools, say. Funnily enough, the richer, better educated parents tended to secure their kids a better education even when there wasn't much choice in the in the school system, maybe because they could afford to live in better areas or because they could just be pushier with the teachers and the headmasters and so on. We introduced more school choice, and that actually now is a benefit which is open to a far greater range of people. Again, let's just do these things. The ideas have been banging around for so long, and we go back and forth. We kind of oscillate, don't we? More choice, less choice, more choice, less choice across public services in Britain. I think we just need the political commitment to really go for it.
Absolutely. I think it's fundamentally about allowing individuals to make those choices because they're able to make those choices better than the government can. And I think that, Julian Legrand, he wrote a book that I read whilst I was a student at LSE. I think it was some kind of play on Adam Smith's Invisible Hands. And he discussed this very point. And actually, when you allow consumers and you treat patients as consumers, or indeed families sending their children to school as consumers, they're able to make those assessments on a much more specific basis that is much more tailored to what they specifically want than a government bureaucrat is able to do for a large number of people. And that's really kind of at the heart of what a market does, that it allows so many of those individuals to make those choices. And of course, all of them are making, in some ways, cost-benefit analyses every time they're making an economic decision. And so we have to ensure that it is an economic decision, that they are afforded those choices, and that they effectively, the power is then handed back to those individuals rather than at the hand of government bureaucrats.
Well, that's why it took someone like Julien Legrand, who is not a free marketeer, but he came up with this quasi-market idea, the new, what was it called? The new management school or something.
New public management.
Yes.
Yeah.
Where he is very much against market prices in the NHS or in public services more general. Yes, but he does realize that there are other barriers to access than money. So you can have a system where on paper everybody gets access on the basis of need, but politically, well, it doesn't really work out that way. So some people are just better to navigate a political system than others, and therefore, expanding choice can be more egalitarian, even if it isn't immediately everybody who makes use of those opportunities. But I think, and one of the consequences of the Blair-era choice reforms was that it wasn't actually true that only the university-educated people make use of those opportunities. Some people with much more basic levels of education did as well, and why not?
And you made this argument in your paper that you published last year on the denationalisation of the NHS. In one of the steps in which you turn integrated care boards into effectively a national provider, it then means that people can then choose if they want to make a choice, or they can just stick with the basic level. And actually it means that many of those people will be able to make those choices. But if they don't want to make those choices, they don't have to, and they have that default option that is already baked in. And I think it's really interesting because it means that you then allow for those steps to occur, and actually you could in some ways develop the National Health Service into a more choice-based system in that way.
Yes, so the idea was about meta choice. You can also in a market, you can choose how much choice you want to have. That's also always the case when we go to supermarkets. If you are, say, standing in front of a shelf with millions of different types of wine and it overwhelms you and you find it stressful, well, then you can go to a smaller supermarket where they make a pre-selection for you. And, the paradox of choice, that doesn't have to be a problem, or markets can deal with this. And that's also the case in an area like healthcare, where we did have this debate in the Blair era where the opponents were saying, well, but patients don't really want choice. Well, okay, if they don't want it, there is going to be an option for them. So in some of the systems I've written about, in Switzerland, this is particularly well developed, where you can choose an insurance option where you can go to whatever healthcare provider you want, but you can also choose an option where there is an integrated health center and you are limited to that. That's the first port of call. It would only be once you have something that they cannot treat, where they would say, well, you need to seek outside expertise. But if you want to limit your own choice in that way, you can do that. And it can be a more efficient arrangement because that then means that everything is provided in-house. Nobody has an incentive to somehow shift the burden onto someone else. And that option is there. You don't have to make free choices all the time. You can limit yourself in advance and say, well, you guys are the experts. You know this better than I do. I'm happy to defer to you.
So his point is there, you have the choice to make the choice to limit your choices. And I think we'll leave it there. Kristian, thank you so much for joining me. Tom, thank you for joining me. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about the IEA, consider becoming an Insider subscriber at insider.iea.org.uk.